Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Steve Lees. I'm an independent planning consultant and have been for the last 10 years. And prior to that, I spent the majority of my local government planning life at Test Valley Borough Council, where I was in charge of the policy team. So I've got quite a bit of experience in drafting, defending and implementing local plans. So what we're hopefully going to try and do tonight is set the context within which planning can hopefully help support the chalk streams of England and in particular of Hampshire. I've committed one of the sins which I always say I would never do, and that is put some very detailed slides. So don't be put off by the fact there's a lot of text. I'm not going to read them all out, but the intention is that you would have a good reference point post this webinar and next week's, which you can then refer to. So no need to make any detailed notes this evening. And again, just apologies for there's an awful lot to get through. In fact, when I looked at it this morning, I think I've tried to compress an entire module for an undergraduate planning course into 18 slides. So hopefully we'll all pass with flying colours. Next slide. I also am a little bit croaky, so now and again I may have to break off just to get a drink of water. So I think the first thing to say about the planning system as we dive into it is you wouldn't be starting from this point if you were looking to sort of protect the chalk streams of Hampshire and Britain. It's very complicated, maybe overly complicated so, but we will try, say this evening, to try and wade through it as best we can. Chris mentioned that there's going to be two webinars. This one's going to look at the framework within which planning policy is prepared, and I'll highlight some of the key elements related to the water environment and the scope for which it could then help the planning system. And then in the second webinar, we'll look a bit more in detail at the sort of planning application process. Next slide. Okay, it may come out during the course of this presentation that I do have a sense of humour, and this first slide sort of illustrates that I think one of the issues as a planning practitioner, both on the public and in the private sector, that when it comes to the water environment, there is a tendency for planners to defer the issues to be resolved to other agencies, such as the Environment Agency, Natural England, or indeed the Water Company. And certainly the government, through the National Planning Policy Framework, is very clear that planners shouldn't really get into other people's business. And I just mentioned there paragraph 201 of the NPPF, which says that planners should assume that the regulatory processes of agencies like the Environment Agency, Natural England, or indeed the sort of legislation related to water companies is working efficiently. And that's been the sort of the backdrop for planners not wanting to get too involved into water-related matters. Next slide, please. But, and it's a good but, there's been some recent case law and indeed planning inspectors' appeal decisions, and we'll perhaps touch upon them in part 2 of this series, is the fact that actually planners can get involved. And there's this case here, Crest Nicholson. The courts are very clear that it isn't a duty, I beg your pardon, of local planning authorities that they have to rely on others doing their job properly for it not to have to do its job properly. And again, the paragraphs 187 and 192 are the ones which say that planners should take a close interest in the impact on the environment in relation to sort of pollution and the natural environment. So on the one hand, you've got the government saying you shouldn't really be doing something, and quite happily we've now got the court saying yes, we should. So if you come across a local planning authority which is saying that the pollution of a watercourse isn't really an issue relevant to a planning application, I think you can nod sagely and ask them to read the Crest Nicholson decision. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and that's right. So this is the planning maze. As I said earlier, you can't really make it any more complicated than it actually is, but this is the system that we've got, so let's make the best use of it. The key point to make is that the control and use of land is governed by various planning acts. It started in 1947 and has been continued in the 1990 and 2004 acts, and hopefully will survive the current planning and infrastructure bill. The government has been busily undermining, I think, some of this well-established legislation, but at the moment we still need to get a planning permission if we want to do something when it comes to the change of use of land and buildings. So there's the key bits of legislation for planners, but I've also listed there a number of other bits of legislation, which if you're going to get involved in trying to protect chalk streams, you just need to be aware of. Not going to go through them, but it's just to give you an example that there's an awful lot of regulatory and statutory responsibilities and requirements which are laid out and which have to be followed. Next slide, please. Once you finish reading all those acts of Parliament, your next homework task is to familiarise yourself with the National Planning Policy Framework, and the latest version came out at the end of 2004. It's an important document. It's the go-to for planners, so whether they are dealing with planning applications or indeed drawing up planning policy documents, this is their starting point, and it sets out what the government thinks planners should be doing. And again, I mentioned just 3 paragraphs. There are many more, but the 3 I've noted there are the ones most relevant. That paragraph 201 was the one which said you shouldn't really get involved in other people's regulatory business, and we've now covered that off with the Crest-Nicholson reference, and therefore draw your attention to the other 2 paragraphs, which is all about assessing the impact of development on the environment and for environment. Read the water environment. Next, please. Again, once you've waded through the numerous pages of the National Planning Policy Framework, the government thinks that you need some additional advice on how to apply its advice. And this comes in the form of these, what we call PPGs. There are, I think, more than 20 of them. These are the ones that I've highlighted, which are the most relevant to the water environment. And again, it's what the planners day to day will be familiar with and working with. And again, it'd be helpful if you have that similar familiarity. It's not just about PPGs. There's also written ministerial statements, which are an expression of government policy. And a good example is the recent discussions that have been around local energy standards. And I think in response to some recent case law, a new written ministerial statement has recently come out. And again, it's something that we need to take note of. In addition to that, if a minister stood up in the Houses of Parliament or gave an after-dinner speech and expressed an opinion on policy, that potentially could also be treated as guidance. So again, it's good for practitioners to keep an eye on what ministers are saying when they're delivering speeches in places like the Labour Party conference, as we've had this last week. There's been quite a bit of discussion over the years in terms of the status of these various documents. Now, the government would like all plan makers to follow their guidance, which is set out in the MPPF and the PPG. But again, thankfully, the courts have reminded everybody that in effect, these are guidelines, not tramlines. And it's a well-established principle that if you've got a local plan, you don't have to slavishly adhere to what's in the MPPF and the PPGs. But if you do depart from the advice in those documents, it needs to be justified. Next slide, please. A little bit more sort of in terms of the context of the framework of planning and planning policy. I'm sure you'll be aware that planning applications can get refused and they do go to appeal, and how inspectors apply national guidance and how they interpret local policies can shape how those policies are in fact drafted in the future and are implemented. And I've mentioned a case here which we'll talk about next week, which is a good example. And similarly, as I've touched upon before with the Crest-Nicholson case, what the courts say when decisions are challenged by a judicial review can be extremely important. And the more senior the court, the more significant the decision. So if the Supreme Court rules on a particular planning matter, everybody needs to sit up and take notice And I've mentioned some cases there, which we will talk about next week. Next slide, please. Okay, then, so drilling down a little bit more, when it comes to planning applications, any decisions on them needs to be made in accordance with the development plan, which in layman's terms is the local plan, or indeed a neighbourhood plan covering the area of your borough, village, town or city. You can depart from the development plan, provided there is a justification for doing so. So you can see right at the outset that if you've got some good policies in your local plan which relate to chalk streams and the natural environment, that's going to be most helpful when it comes to potentially commenting on, maybe objecting to planning applications. As I mentioned earlier, the government want you, the local planning authority, not to stray too far from the guidance that they've issued. And certainly an examining inspector will take a very close look at local plans which do just that. However, from the references I've made earlier, it doesn't rule out local authorities effectively doing their own thing, provided they've got the information to do that. And a good recent example is Winchester City Council, whose local plan has just concluded its examination. It's almost finished. And the inspector seems to be supportive of that council's local energy standards, despite what he said in the relevant written ministerial statement. So if you think that your local plan, or indeed your neighbourhood plan, doesn't go far enough in terms of what protection is required for, say, chalk streams, for example, and the local authority planners seem reluctant to depart from the MPF guidance, then you've got lots of good reasons and good examples, provided you've got the evidence that they can take a more proactive approach. Next slide, please. So the question then is, if the development plan is an important document, how do you influence the content of it? Well, there's some good and some bad news. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Certainly there are examples of local plans that have taken years and years to prepare, and some people have lost the will to live when they've tried to influence those processes which have led to their adoption. The government are now looking to sort of shorten the timetable considerably, and under new proposals, the target is that they should be completed within 3 years. However, that said, the public have a formal role to play in the preparation of development plans, and certainly I'd encourage everybody to take every opportunity to contribute, certainly at the formal stages, but perhaps more importantly, not to wait for an announcement that a local plan has been published, but certainly to get involved in as early a stage as possible, and certainly try and promote the cause, in this case of chalk streams, with officers and councillors. And I say that in the context of the letter that the Wildlife Trust got over 140 councillors in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to sign the letter to the Minister regarding the future of chalk streams. So across the county, I think there's an awful lot of political support for doing something more than we have done in the past. And again, good examples of that are the Rights of Rivers declarations, which we've seen, first of all, I think, in Basingstoke, and that's now been followed by Southampton and Test Valley. So I think if you were to go to the local authorities now and say you want them to do more to support chalk streams on the evidence of the letter and the Rights of Rivers Charter, I hopefully would think you'd be pushing at an open door. Next slide, please. So this is just a little outline of what the emerging proposals are for local plan preparation, which I think you should be aware of. The first thing that a local authority needs to do is publish a project initiation document, which is a horrible title, which in effect defines the scope of the plan and sets out how the community will be involved. So you can see why it'd be important, even before that document is published, if you can get your arguments in front of the council about the importance of chalk streams and the need for them to be protected, and to get that included in that initiation document would be a very positive start. There are 2 formal consultation periods where you will have to go through the process of some dreadful online form to fill in and setting out your comments. And if they haven't been satisfactorily dealt with, then you can appear at the examination in public in front of an inspector. Now, that isn't quite the daunting prospect that it used to be. So if you do end up at an examination, they do tend to be quite informal now. And the days of being harangued by barristers is sort of long gone. As I mentioned earlier, that the development plan could be a local plan or a neighbourhood plan. And there's a very similar approach to neighbourhood plans in terms of the new arrangements, i.e. they've got to identify the scope of the plan, a couple of stages of consultation, the examination, but more importantly, there's that referendum stage. And I suspect some of you may well have been involved in the preparation of neighbourhood plans. Next slide, please. Okay, so this sort of brings some of those thoughts I've just covered together in terms of some handy hints. I think the first thing to do is register your interest with your local authority to be kept informed. It can be a devil of a job to keep track of what local authorities are up to in terms of their plan preparation, but most of them have a sort of website where you can sign up and be kept informed and updates, and at least be aware of when key critical stages of the plan are being prepared and considered by a council. You may well not be alone in all of this in terms of chalk streams, so there may well be opportunities to contribute to discussion groups. By all means, try and sign up for those. Very often you will get local authorities will set up forums and steering groups to discuss different aspects of the plan. And again, through the being kept informed, you may be alerted to these, and they'll provide you with an opportunity to sort of fight your cause, as it were. Don't forget the role of your local councillor. They will have to have an active involvement in the preparation of their local plan, or they should do, and they will have a formal role to play at the various decision-making stages. So by all means, lobby your local councillor and seek their support in terms of promoting the course that you're most keen on. If possible, try and suggest approaches and wordings to policies which would help protection of chalk streams. Currently, the local plan for Test Valley, which I'm reasonably familiar with, is quite quiet in terms of what it says about the protection of the River Test and all its tributaries. And certainly there's no harm in anybody putting forward an example from perhaps other local plans of how perhaps that gap could be closed. Get others involved if you can. Find other organisations who are perhaps of a similar interest. And finally, but perhaps importantly, a lot of these rivers and streams in Hampshire are privately owned, and it can be most helpful to have their support in terms of what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. Okay, there's an awful lot goes into preparing local plans, and it's quite a task for the local authority teams, but they don't do it in sort of isolation. And they'll be drawing on other documents produced by other organisations in drafting their own local plan. A key document to look out for is a water cycle study. I believe Basingstoke did one a couple of years ago, and they may well be updating it for their next version of their plan. And I think Test Valley also is another example that I've seen where they try to bring together various bits of important information and create a picture of the water environment. So certainly try and get your hands on that. You will also get help, I suspect, from these other documents that I've listed, and in particular sort of river basin management plans, which has its own life in terms of how they're prepared. I would say keep an eye on those and certainly refer to them, because they're the document, that's the document where the Environment Agency has to outline where it's identified a watercourse in sort of poor condition, that it has to set out proposals for its improvement. So quite a lot to get through, but again, useful sources of information. And if they're being used by the local authority to promote their local plan, there may well be useful information for you to promote your own particular interest. Next slide, please. Just continuing that theme, there is an awful lot of information out there. One of the joys of the internet is that it's far more accessible than it has been in the past, and I think it's a lot easier, although still hard work, to draw information together in support of your particular approach. And again, I've just listed a few of the examples there. What's also, I think, helpful in terms of framing a response is the rights of the river charter, particularly for those authorities which have signed up to it. And I think that can provide a framework for drafting a response. So next slide, please. So for those of you who perhaps haven't seen one of these declarations, and apologies to those of you who have, I have highlighted in those bullet points the key sort of rights that are enshrined in these charters. And I think they provide a very useful sort of aid memoir in terms of saying to a local authority, you said the rights of rivers are important, and under each of these headings, this is what we would like you to do. And so I've tried here to sort of relate the right to the sort of planning sort of issues. So just to run through this slide, the right to flow, you could say that the use of buffer zones to enable the river to flow freely would be a good idea. So you could see a planning policy perhaps on the width of buffer zones, maybe 5, 10, 15 metres, whatever. It needs to perform an essential function within the ecosystem. Well, that could be flood risk. So there need to be policies around flood risk, and also indeed around sort of water supply and the demand for water. Be free from pollution and contamination. So there's a strong case for particular policies which would try and limit the potential for contamination. To feed and be fed by suitable aquifers, etc., etc. Well, that's where I think we could potentially start to base ideas and policies around sort of water efficiency, the use of sustainable urban drainage, and policies to protect the aquifer from pollution. And in terms of obviously biodiversity and restoration, they very much chime with existing policies which seek to make sure that existing biodiversity isn't harmed, and indeed is actually enhanced through the biodiversity net gain policy. And finally, regeneration and restoration, I think that could chime with initiatives like green and blue infrastructure, and could link back into the River Basin's management plan in terms of identifying particular schemes that could enhance the condition of a watercourse. So I think that's a really sort of useful, particularly in terms of Basingstoke and Test Valley, to actually sort of use their commitment to that rights of rivers can be very helpful in pursuing positive policies in a local plan. Next slide, please. This is just perhaps a little bit of stating the obvious, but it's not just about local planning authorities and their local plans. There are a number of other agencies which we hinted at right at the outset, which are responsible for various aspects of the water environment. And again, just as an aid memoir, I've illustrated some of them here. I have highlighted the river basin management plans. That's definitely a must to keep an eye on. DEFRA doing some interesting stuff around the environmental land management, and the Catchment Partnership Initiative, which I think the Trust is leading along with the Rivers Trust. That's another mechanism for trying to draw planning and the water environment together. And let's not forget Hampshire County Council as the local lead flood authority, and in particular their responsibilities around surface water runoff, which I know can be an issue in respect to planning applications. So their policies and practices and what they have to say about surface water can be quite critical and important to chalk streams. Next slide, please. And then just continue with some of the key players. Natural England, obviously, with their focus on biodiversity and trying to improve biodiversity, is going to be important. Certainly, we've seen that in terms of their approach to some nitrates and phosphate issues. So anything that they produce in terms of the water environment is going to be worth knowing about. We owe a lot to various landowners and fishing interests in terms of trying to manage the existing sort of chalk streams and rivers in Hampshire, and I've listed certainly some of them there. And in particular, I'd highlight sort of fish legal and wild fish, who have become quite active, I would say, in terms of legal challenges to water companies and indeed the Environment Agency. And there's a lot of useful stuff on their websites. And then also you've also got the likes of the Wildlife Trust and River Trust and local pressure groups as potential allies in what you're seeking to do. Next, please. So that hopefully is a very quick sort of run through, and hopefully it gives you a flavour of what can be quite a complex planning framework, but at the same time there are lots of opportunities to use that framework to inform and influence this sort of future sort of planning framework in terms of policy across Hampshire. And happy to take some questions. Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody. Just a little bit about me. I've got over 40 years of experience in planning, mostly in local government, and most of that was in Test Valley Borough Council in the planning policy team. In the last 10 years, I've actually been an independent planning consultant, offering advice to both public and private sector clients. And I've also dabbled with the education system for planners, which is interesting. And I've been an external examiner for a couple of the planning schools, one in Bristol and one in Leeds. So moving on to tonight's presentation. In the first webinar, just a quick recap, hopefully I got across the point about the importance of local plans and development plan documents in the process. And then hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll sort of appreciate why it's important to get your sticky mitts on the sort of local plans of your area and try and influence them in terms of having good planning policies when it comes to trying to protect the chalk streams in your area. So next slide, please. Okay, so the cornerstone of the planning system since 1947 has been the need to get approval for the use of land, although there are obviously some exceptions. So that's been a cornerstone of planning, quite where we'll end up when this government is finished with trying to dismantle the system. Goodness only knows, but at the moment, this is the framework that we've got. And the key point for this evening, as of last week, is that decisions on planning applications should be made in accordance with the development plan, unless there's some good reasons to do otherwise. So that's a good starting point for us. And then when it comes to actually responding to planning applications, I mean, it is a bit of a planning maze, and there are different types of planning application, but the two you should be most sort of familiar with, if not already, is the outline planning application, where the principle of development is established, and apart normally from where the access would go, all the other matters, so including things that we'd be interested in from a water environment, such as drainage, and the disposal of wastewater, will often be the subject to planning conditions to be resolved at a later date. And these are often called reserved matters and will be the subject of separate applications. I mean, this can be a bit confusing to people, because you could find that permission is being given for some houses, and yet all the key details which you may be interested in this case, the water environment, are to come at a later date. But as you'll find out later, there's a little bit of a sting in the tail for developers who think they've got across the line. And the other main sort of approach in terms of applications is a full application, where you pretty much get all the information to address all the issues that are pertinent to the planning permission being issued. And again, there might be some conditions, colours of bricks, that kind of stuff, which would need to be submitted and approved. But a full application pretty much allows a developer to proceed to developing a site. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the sort of application process. First question is, well, how do you know when an application has been registered? How do you know that there's one in your area that might be of interest to you? And I've just set out in this slide a number of different avenues where you can find out about planning applications. And a site notice should be posted on the site, which isn't very helpful if you don't walk past it. There will also be neighbour notification letters to the nearest sort of people who are affected by it, weekly listed newspapers, etc., etc. So all I can advise there is you need to keep your eye particularly on the council's website for their list of new applications, and it should be fairly easy to find. And once you've found the application, you've got the application number, then again via the website you should be able to follow the application and see what's going on. I'd also add that developers are encouraged by the planning system to engage with the community where the proposal is prior to the application going in. Now, it's not a requirement, but a lot of developers do it, and I've been involved in quite a few in the last few years. So if something like that crops up, somebody wants to build some houses in a field near you, do go along, certainly to express your views, but also thinking of the topic tonight. If you've got local relevant information about the site, whether it floods or doesn't flood, the ecology which you may have some knowledge of, by all means, let the developers and their agents know, because whilst they'll be doing hopefully a thorough search themselves, there's nothing like a little bit of local knowledge to inform what may be proposed. Next slide, please. A key person in the whole process is the case officer, and I'd thoroughly recommend trying to make friends with them if you can. And they have a very key role in terms of how the process is actually delivered. One of their jobs, which isn't a very exciting one, is to act as a postal service in terms of getting out the consultations to all the sort of key agencies, and then collating and analysing not only their responses, but also the responses from the public. And certainly, as you can imagine, on a big application, that is quite a task. So never mind the balancing act that they're going to have to go through when they come to draft their report with a recommendation for permission or to refuse it. They can get sidetracked by the administration of the process rather than perhaps the thinking part of the process, which, as far as we'd be concerned, is the most important part. So I think the key lesson from this slide is stay in touch with the case officer, and certainly if you can, be friendly to them as best you can. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know about the planning application, we probably know who the case officer is, and this is where the test of endurance actually starts. For those of you who have looked at big applications, you'll know just how much information is buried on the website under that planning application reference number. And I think the key thing here to say is that use that information as best you can to support your case, because the key theme that I would stress upon you is that writing an objection and then not being able to back it up with some evidence isn't going to be a very effective objection. And so by all means, drill down into the information that's available on the planning application to see if there's stuff there that can help you. And the sorts of places to look for, and a lot of local authorities, the way they describe the documents isn't always helpful, but hopefully you would find information relating to the water environment in either the planning statement, the design and access statement, and obviously a drainage strategy on a site, so flood risk assessment would hopefully jump out at you and be much easier to find than other information. A lot of those documents would contain quite technical information, but helpfully most give a summary somewhere in the document so you can understand what the sort of key issues are. I mentioned earlier that the case officer would be consulting various people, and the three key agencies, as far as we're concerned with the water environment, would be the water company, which is mainly Southern Water in this part of the world, the Environment Agency, and Hampshire County Council as the lead local flood authority. And certainly if you're tracking an application, what they have to say is certainly documents you need to have a look at. The other thing to say is that consultees may respond more than once. So if you've looked at a website in May and seen what the Environment Agency has to say, don't be surprised if something then pops up months later where the applicant has responded to queries from the Environment Agency, Hampshire, or the water companies, and then produced more information, which hopefully will address issues that have been raised, or they may not. So it's a bit of an effort to keep tabs on what's going on. But if you want to be effective in any response and applications, I'm afraid that's what you're going to have to do. Next slide, please. Okay, just jumping that just back a sort of stage. So where to start? You've read all the information. You think you sort of understand it all, and you've got to try and perhaps marshal your thoughts in the form of a response. And this slide, and I think the next one, just sets out a load of sort of questions, which if I was the planning officer, I would be asking. And if you're looking to, and I'm assuming you're unhappy about a planning application, its impact on a chalk stream or river, these are the sorts of questions that you should be asking, and then looking to find the answers in the relevant information. And if it's not there, or you're unhappy with it, then you've got the sort of framework for responding to the case officer. Next slide, please. So again, here's some more sort of prompts, which hopefully would help you frame your response on a planning application. Next slide, please. Okay, I've strayed into this slide. This is actually about the response. And the first thing I would say, and I suspect planning authorities wouldn't be too happy when I say this, is that you'll very often get, say, a neighbour notification letter saying something like, planning application for X number of houses, blah, 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 blah. You've got 21 days to comment. And then you go and look on the website and you think, how on earth am I going to do this in the time that's been sort of identified by the sort of consultation period? What I would say is, don't be put off by that deadline. That's not a statutory deadline, and you can in fact make comments on a planning application right up to the point until a decision is made. And that could be prior to a committee, send information in, or post committee and the decision hasn't been issued. If something significant comes to light, then local authorities have to take it into account. So by all means, get holding response or get your objection in as soon as you can, but don't be put off by the thought that you maybe only have 3 weeks in which to comment. If you're looking for support from within the council, I'm sure people do this already, contact your local councillor, keep them informed of what's happening, because later on in the process, when it comes to decision making, most councils, pretty much all councils, will have what they call a scheme of delegation, where the officers can actually make the decision to either permit or to refuse. Now, there will be certain criteria which they have to apply, but you may well get a situation where if the schemes or the application is consistent with the local plan, for example, then the planning officer could recommend permission even if there are people who have objected. By the same sort of process of the scheme of delegation, local councillors usually get consulted to see if they want to have that application brought to committee. And that is often an effective way of getting a contentious application to committee. And it enables you then to make your case in front of all of the members. If it goes to a planning committee and it's refused, that isn't the end of the matter. The applicant can go to appeal. And again, there's a process whereby you can get involved. If it's a written appeal, so it's just written submissions only, you can make further comments. If it's an informal hearing or a formal inquiry, you do have the opportunity to turn up and speak. So don't be put off by the processes, particularly the informal hearing, which is, I think, most of the live hearings appeals are now under that process. It's a lot less intimidating than the formal process where you've got leading barristers sort of jousting with each other. Again, once the decision is made at a planning appeal stage, that's not the final end of the matter. Decisions can be challenged through the process of judicial review. So if you've got about £30,000–40,000 to spare in your back pocket, you can lodge a judicial review. And that's when the courts get involved, but they will only get involved in terms of, was the decision properly made? They won't comment on the merits of the planning application. They are just looking to make sure that a decision was made which can be justified and was reasonable on those grounds. But they can be important. Certainly the outcome of some of the court cases can lead to changes in legislation and changes in guidance. And we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've made your comments. The application's been considered. and the decision has come out. And what these slides are going to hopefully demonstrate now is just how some of the topics are dealt with by the planning process. And sometimes the outcome isn't what you expected. One of the key issues that planning applications will flag up is building in the floodplain. Now, the traditional approach has been that you shouldn't be building in an area which is at risk of flooding, and you should always put development in areas of lower risk. And in the planning parlance, that's called the sequential test. The government got into a bit of a pickle in that they produced a planning policy guidance note earlier this year, which actually was in conflict with the National Planning Policy Framework, and it left planners and barristers trying to work out what it all meant. The government have now, I think in September, produced a new PPG where they've clarified their approach. And in essence, they are now providing greater flexibility for developers to build in areas at risk of flooding. And what they are saying now is you do not have to undertake the sequential test and prove that there's no other alternative sites at lower risk. What you can do is to demonstrate through your planning application that the type of development proposed, i.e. housing, which is classed as vulnerable, is not in an area at risk of flooding. That if there is a bit of an issue, are the escape routes, i.e. the road network, are they at risk from flooding? Answer, hopefully no. And finally, you could also put in place measures to mitigate the risk of flooding by putting in flood defences. So we are starting to see in the planning world now applications where development is taking place. So effectively, the housing is on the higher ground, but things like public open space and other land uses which aren't considered vulnerable are actually now being permitted, which is quite a significant change. What I would say is in terms of the local plan process, the local authority should be applying the sequential test when it comes to allocating sites for development. So the guidance in the PPG doesn't apply when you're producing your local plan. So local plans should not be identifying sites that are at risk of flooding for development. There is a bit of a problem with this new approach from the government in that you might be permitting development on low-lying land where the housing isn't at risk itself, but how do you drain the site if you've got a high water table in close proximity to a sort of watercourse? And this comes back to that important point I made earlier about planning conditions and reserve matters. So you could get planning permission in an area with some of the land at risk of flooding, but when it comes to the surface water and how the site will be drained, if you can't demonstrate that it will work effectively because of, say, the high water table, then you've got a problem, and it may be that you can't develop a site after all. Next topic, next slide, please. Another topic that's come up is that of water quality. And again, just harking back to the first seminar, I did talk about the sort of conflicting guidance that's in the NPPF. And these are quotes from some of it. Excuse me, is that what planning should be doing is avoiding, the risk of pollution when it's considering development, and that can come from various sources, certainly from surface water entering the watercourse or from wastewater getting into a watercourse for whatever reason, and there may be other activities which might run the risk of pollution. Now, in the past, water companies, and they still do, have an obligation to accept wastewater, and they very rarely, if ever, have advised local planning authorities that there is a capacity in the network as a reason for refusal. So whilst there might be issues which you would be aware of, it is very rare for the water company to actually object to a development. But as you'll see in a moment, things are changing. More locally, in terms of water quality, people will be aware of sort of the nitrates issue and sort of phosphates on the River Itchen, and that has attracted most people's attention. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the answer is for development now to be nitrate and phosphate sort of neutral. and there are measures in place to try and achieve that. So water quality has started to come up the sort of planning agenda, which is obviously a good thing, but there's a little way to go yet. Next slide, please. Okay, so water quality can be affected by surface water drainage, and this is an issue for the lead local flood authority, which currently is Hampshire, who are consulted on planning applications. And what they'll be looking to do is ensure that there's no increase in the risk of flooding from water runoff, which can be a source of pollution. Again, very often you will see that if it's an outline planning application, they will ask for a condition to be imposed requiring detailed plans to be submitted. So there could well be a problem, but it's a problem if it's an outline application that can be resolved at a later date. And I've just put there so 3 sort of bullet points in terms of the issues which they would need to deal with. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a planning appeal, which is quite an important one, as recently as March this year. And again, I referred to it halfway down the slide, that the conflict within the National Planning Policy Framework, that a couple of the paragraphs, one of which is 197 and the other is 198, is that planning shouldn't be making things worse when it comes to pollution and the risk of pollution. But paragraph 201 effectively said, or the government is saying, when it comes to matters of sort of water quality and pollution, it's not really for planning to sort of get too involved in. You should rely on the fact that other regulatory agencies and bodies will be doing their work and they'll be operating efficiently. But this is a very interesting case because it's turned that approach on its head. So this is a good example of where a planning appeal is actually sort of helping to challenge some of the advice in the NPPF, I think, to the benefit of the water environment. So in this particular case, there was an outline application for housing, which was granted, but subject to a planning condition requiring the foul drainage to be approved. Now, the council weren't very happy about this, and they refused the application because they were not satisfied that there was capacity in the network. And this was despite the water company saying, oh no, there isn't. And what they were saying is because there's uncertainty around the treatment works and its capacity, it's quite likely from the records and the data that they'd got that there could be sort of pollution incidents. I think they used the Rivers Trust to help them gather some of this data. And the inspector was very good and actually refused the application because he could not be, I think it was he could not be satisfied that the requirements in the paragraph 198 and 197 for planning to do its job in terms of the risk of pollution, etc. And that was in terms of planning top trumps overcame paragraph 201. So here we have a very good decision, which is helping people sort of fight their cause, even when statutory bodies like the Environment Agency and then the water company was saying there isn't a problem. There is a sting in this tail, which is what the but is at the bottom, and it's about ecology. I think the council thought while we're having a go at the issue of pollution, we'll also raise the issue that the pollution will then have an adverse impact on a site of special scientific interest. And they didn't really produce any evidence. And because of that, and because the appellant had to sort of counter that argument, the inspector awarded some costs against the council. So that's a salutary lesson in if you're going to pursue an objection all the way to an appeal, certainly as a council, you need to have your evidence available to you. And it's also a good lesson for the public in terms of presenting a robust and evidence-based case. And next slide, please. Okay, this is still on the topic of water quality, but I just thought I'd put this one in because it's not just the planning system which is capable of having an influence on how water courses are treated. So this is from a couple of years ago. So this is the Manchester Ship Canal, and it turns out that the United Utilities Water Company were regularly discharging polluting effluent into the canal. So you can imagine as the owners of the canal, they weren't very happy. And I think the water company was hiding behind the 1991 Water Act in terms of the way it literally discharged its duties. But the court case was very clear, and the judge was very clear, that never mind whatever the 1991 Act said, there were still laws relating to trespass and nuisance. And he ruled in favour of the canal company in terms of the nuisance that was being caused to them and what they were experiencing because of what the water company was doing, and left it for a remedy for them to either through a future injunction or to seek perhaps damages to actually remedy the situation. So this is just an interesting one, is that if you're a riparian landowner, you have an interest in a stream and somebody is polluting it, never mind what the other legislation has to say about water quality, etc. There are other laws, and in this case, nuisance and trespass, which came to help the Chip Canal. Next slide, please. Again, in terms of water quality, this is quite, again, a recent decision. As you can see, April 2025. And by way of introduction, this was all about the Environment Agency and their River Basin Management Plans, the RBMPs. Now, these are very important documents because they are meant to set out the Environment Agency's assessment of an area and the quality or otherwise of the watercourses for which it has sort of jurisdiction over. These documents in turn will be quite important in terms of informing local plans and indeed sort of planning applications. So if you've got a RBMP that says there's a stream or a river, a watercourse that's in sort of poor quality and it needs measures to improve it, and there's a planning application nearby, then you could see that the planning authority and hopefully the Environment Agency could make the link between the two. The problem is, excuse me, is that the Environment Agency, when they've been producing these plans, have actually been listing generic solutions to particular watercourses, not specific ones. And in the case that we're now looking at here, the anglers in Pickering took the Environment Agency and the Secretary of State to court to say that you should be doing something specific for a particular water body, I can't remember which one it was now, the river, and to improve its quality. And the court found in favour of the association and said something like the Environment Agency can't plead we're too busy or we haven't got enough money as a reason for not doing their statutory duties. So I understand the Environment Agency are obviously crawling over this judgment now to see what the impact is for their sort of future preparation of their river basin management plans. But again, it's only just an example of how a court case can actually start to shape sort of future policy and future sort of actions, because I think this could have a positive and far-reaching effect on how we approach improving the quality of our watercourses. Next slide, please. Water supply and abstraction. Again, if you're a planner, you're thinking, what's this got to do with the granting of planning permission for the use of land? Isn't that somebody else's job? Well, we've already had one inspector, and in fact, a couple of judges have said, actually, it is your job. And in particular, in the south of the country, sort of, I think mainly in Sussex, east and west Sussex, natural England, have advised that water use should be neutral. So it's coming up the agenda, and linked to that and linked to development is the Environment Agency issuing licenses to abstract water. And the next couple of cases is just going to explain a little bit about what that means in practice. So the South Cambridge decision, it's an appeal decision. And what was important here was that nobody seemed to be disputing that water supply and water quality was a material consideration. The appeal was actually approved by the Secretary of State, and he did so on the basis that there would be a scheme in the future which would achieve the sort of water neutrality and provide the water supply that was needed, and also interestingly set a planning condition which set a limit on the amount of water that could be consumed at 89 litres per person per dwelling, and that's the lowest I've seen, and that's been initiated by a Secretary of State. So this is a decision which shows that even at the highest level now, there's a recognition about the impact on development of water supply and the demand for water. Next slide, please. Okay, this is still on the subject of abstraction, but again, it's an example of how a different bit of legislation is actually having a significant impact on the way we approach the water environment. So this was a site on the Norfolk Broads where the Environment Agency were, I think, renewing abstraction licenses and granting new licenses. And Mr. and Mrs. Harris took them to court, the judicial review, saying that they hadn't done their job properly and looked at a more comprehensive and a much wider area of search when it came to assessing the impact of abstracting water. And in particular, it was failing in its duties under the Habitat Directive. The courts agreed and said, yes, they are failing in their duty and that they must take a much more comprehensive approach. And again, I think the comment was made that the EA can't rely on a lack of resources for not doing the job for which they have a legal duty. So this again is just an example of how something happening in a different part of the legislative world is going to have an impact on the way we sort of treat the water environment. Next slide, please. Okay, I think this is the last one. This is again Horsham District Council, who I think they're quite a lively bunch. They're always appearing in the court reports and in the planning press about challenging development when they think they've got a good case. And this is one about sort of water neutrality, but it could be any topic related to the water environment. They'd got outline planning permission, which had actually been on appeal, but the inspector imposed a condition which said they couldn't occupy the development until they'd actually sorted out where the water was coming from. And they wanted to sort of, well, the company challenged this, and their argument was, well, that's somebody else's job. That's the EA and Southern Water to come up with proposals, which means that the supply of water won't be a problem, and therefore we haven't got a problem. And again, the judge said, well, no, there's no legal requirement to proceed on the basis of that paragraph in the MPPF, which says that other regimes should operate efficiently. So again, it's a good and recent example of how developers are going to have to think a bit more carefully and perhaps more cleverly about how they're going to address these very important issues around sort of water supply, water quality, etc. That's the end of the presentation, Chris. Oh, no, it isn't. Sorry, I thought that was the last slide. I beg your pardon. Sorry, my apologies. This is meant to be a little aide-memoire, which is if you want to have a good sort of concise summary of how planning inspectors deal with various issues around the water environment, have a look at this appeal decision where the issues of surface water, wastewater and water supply were all dealt with. And if you've not researched a planning appeal decision before, all you have to do is Google sort of planning appeals inspectorate, search appeals, and there'll be a box where you can insert that number. The box is normally on the right hand side of the screen, and for free you can read that planning decision. And hopefully this is the last one. This is very much close to home. It's about 200 meters from my house. And this was the only decision I could find where landscape was an issue. So normally when it comes to the water environment, it's about water quality, etc., etc. But this was about the setting of a water body. In fact, it's called the Barge Canal, although there's no barges on it and it's not a canal anymore. But it is an SSSI, and the developer wanted to put 43 houses adjacent to it. Now, most of the technical reasons that were raised by the application could be addressed, but in this particular case, the inspector just didn't like the impact on the character and setting of the area, and in particular of the canal corridor. And this is the only one I've found so far where the setting of the watercourse has actually been sort of questioned, and it's come down in favour of the local authority which was pursuing that argument. And on ecology, again, I've not really come across any really good decisions in terms of ecology, other than to make the point in the Wilden case, which is that if you're going to argue ecology and it's been harmed by a development, it's not an easy task to actually identify what the problem is and to say it will be made worse by this development. That's not to say that it couldn't be done, but it's very rarely sort of achieved unless it's something like an international designation. Thank you. Really was the end.